On our computers, we have several different types of connection devices that plug in externally to our computer. And on the back, we notice we have our Ethernet ports, we have USB ports available. We even have a eSATA connection here on the back, which is another type of external connection that we can plug in there. You may not have all these different types of connections on your computer. You may have more, or you may have less, different types. It just depends really on the computer make and the computer model and the motherboard type, or if you have any expansion cards put in. A lot of computers now will also have ports on the front of the computer, so they're a bit easier to get to, especially when you're plugging in devices such as USBs. A few devices that we'll talk about are going to be USB, Firewire, eSATA, as well as Ethernet. A USB most people are familiar with. Some people refer to this as a USB. The USB is actually the connector on the end of this device. That connector can connect everything from a small flash stick up to an external hard drive. So we have an external hard drive here which holds a vast more amount of data than that small stick. The small stick, while holding only 2 gigabytes of data, this external hard drive can hold up to 3 terabytes of data, which is a few thousand times more data than this actual stick itself. 2 gigabytes, again, being the next step up would be the terabyte, so 1,024 gigabytes would equal 1 terabyte. So it's a vast difference as between the 2 gigabytes and 1 terabyte, but it all goes through the same connector. Now this connector has seen a couple improvements over the years. The original USB connector, so we'll call this USB 1.0, could only transmit data at 12 megabytes per second. And if we're using a 3 terabyte external hard drive, that's not going to be quite enough for us. So they stepped it up and they did more development and they released USB 2.0. And that actually allowed us a transfer speed up to 480 megabytes per second. This transfer speed is the amount of data that can transfer back between the computer and the device over the connection. And then we're now currently at USB 3.0. We can transfer us up to 5 gigabytes a second. Now, not all devices that we buy will be USB 3.0. They may be older versions, or they may even be USB 1.0, just depending on the amount of cost that the manufacturer wanted to put into creating that device. So it's good to check it out and good to determine the specifications of the device that you're using to decide or to determine which speed the device is. And keep in mind that just because you have a USB 3.0 device doesn't mean that the computer port that you're plugging into is USB 3.0 either. Both ends of the equation have to be USB 3.0 or say USB 2.0 in order to talk back and forth at that speed. If you have a USB 3.0 device, but your computer port is only USB 2.0, you're only going to transmit at max at USB 2.0 speeds. So you can actually get expansion cards that have USB 3.0 ports on them if you want to use those ports just for transferring a lot amount of data. Now, the next type of connection that we can take a look at is called a Firewire cable. Now, Firewire cable is similar to our USB cable in that it has, it's just a standard connector that we have a small blocky connector at the end. But a Firewire cable will have, whereas the USB connector is more of a small flat connector, a Firewire cable will be a bit more blocky. We don't have one here today, but you can definitely check out what a Firewire cable looks like online and check out different types of them and different lengths. Firewire cables come in different types, just like the USB connectors do. The initial Firewire cable was IEEE 1394A, and this Firewire cable is more commonly referred to as Firewire cable 400. Now that's because it transmits at 400 megabytes per second. There is another iteration. This one is going to be IEEE 1394B, more commonly referred to as 800 series, because this one, as you can probably guess, transfers at 800 megabytes a second. Now this Firewire cable we may see on digital recording devices like video cameras, or we may also see on a couple older external hard drives, whereas a lot of external hard drives now may use eSATA or USB 3.0. We can still find devices that use a Firewire connector on them to transfer our data back and forth. Our next to last device is going to be our eSATA connection. Now, an eSATA connection is a very similar, or eSATA connection rather, is a very similar connection to the ones that we would see on our internal hard drives. And the E, of course, as you can guess, stands for external SATA connection. And this is most commonly used with external hard drives. We can show here on our demonstration computer that we do have one eSATA port. This eSATA port connects directly to the computer onto the motherboard, and it allows us to connect an external hard drive with transfer speeds that are a lot faster than just a standard USB connection. Our eSATA connections come in a couple variants as well. Our first iteration will actually be 1.5 gigabytes a second. Our second iteration, after more development, was up to 3 gigabytes a second. The most current iteration is up to 6 gigabytes a second. This 6 gigabyte a second is obviously slightly faster than our 5 gigabyte a second USB 3.0 connection, and can be used in instances where we have an external hard drive that we need to get that information transferred off faster than a USB 3.0 will handle. And if we're transferring that information a lot and we have a lot of drives to use, then the 6 gigabit per second connection is very handy for us. One of the final types of connections that we'll talk about with our external storage devices is actually an Ethernet connection, like the type of cable that we use for our internet. Now, this Ethernet connection just plugs into our computer and it connects us to the network. But how does this count as an external storage device connection? Well, on our network we can actually have network storage, such as network attached storage devices which hold vast amounts of memory, or say you're in an office situation and you have external drives or servers that host shared folders. Those shared folders are considered external storage devices because you connect to them over your Ethernet connection. Two speeds that we really want to focus on is going to be our fast Ethernet at 100 megabytes per second, and then our gigabit Ethernet at 1,000 megabytes per second. Say you're in an environment where you're using a fast Ethernet connection and we want to upgrade to a gigabit Ethernet connection. Well, there's a few components that we need to recognize that really make up this transition. It's not as simple as just swapping out a cord or swapping out an Ethernet card. In order to transition from our fast Ethernet to our gigabit Ethernet, we'll start at the computer. Let's say our computer currently has a fast Ethernet connection that maxes out at 100 megabytes per second. That port will actually need to be upgraded to a gigabit Ethernet card. With our port upgraded, we need to make sure that we're using an Ethernet cable that supports up to 1,000 megabytes per second. So now we've upgraded our cable. Keep in mind, we can't just upgrade the cable that goes from our computer into the wall. We have to upgrade the cabling that goes from our computer into the wall, as well as all the cabling throughout our entire environment. Any cables in the ceiling, any cables that go to any servers that we're going to attach to, all the cables from our computer to our destination have to be compatible and able to transmit at gigabit Ethernet speeds. Any ports that we plug into the wall have to be upgraded. Any switches or any firewalls or routers that we connect into have to be able to transmit at gigabit Ethernet speeds. So we'll have our switch that we connect into. And then finally, our device that we're connecting to, in this case our server, also has to have ports that transmit at gigabit Ethernet speeds. So we see out of all of our external type connections, upgrading from fast Ethernet to gigabit Ethernet is probably going to be our most intensive upgrade, rather than whereas USB 3.0 we can just swap out a cable or swap out a device. Upgrading our Ethernet is going to be a whole different ballgame. It can account for tearing out roof tiles, tearing out cables out of floors, reinstalling new Ethernet cards, reinstalling plates into our walls. It's a much more intensive process, and one that should be thought over carefully before you intend to embark on it.